Okay, so Professor Walt, are you?
I'm here.
You're here. So, I mean, do you want to kick things off with your assessment of how things are going in Afghanistan? What's going right or what's going wrong?
I'd be happy to, and then I'd love to hear your views on the same question. I mean, obviously, I think things are not very encouraging at this point, and despite the fact that the United States has put a lot more attention into Afghanistan in recent months, it's hard to see clear signs of progress. If one looks a little bit more widely, I think actually things look even more discouraging. We have obviously a very ineffective government in Kabul. I think no one is happy with the performance of the Karzai government. We've now had one obviously fraudulent election and a second one that certainly appears to have been marred by various forms of malfeasance. We have lots of corruption throughout it, a general sense that the Taliban is getting stronger rather than weaker. Moving next door, as you know, we have a very delicate relationship with the Pakistani government. There are now signs of emerging civil-military tensions there, which isn't very encouraging. And maybe last but not least, the sense that a number of our alliance partners within ISAF are essentially heading for the exits and will be leaving the United States with even more of the burden there. All of this has led me and a number of others to conclude that this is not a war the United States is likely to win, certainly not to win militarily, and that we ought to be thinking about alternatives. But I'll be interested to hear if you have a different appraisal that might be more encouraging.
Well, let's start with Pakistan. I think there are some sort of long-term trends in Pakistan which are kind of easy for people to forget and are actually very are basically on the positive side of a ledger, and I would say there are three. If you look at the coalition of pro-Taliban religious parties known as the MMA, in 2002 they got the largest amount of votes they ever did, mostly because Musharraf had fixed it so the secular parties wouldn't do very well. And they got 11% of the vote, and it allowed them to take over both Baluchistan and Northwest Frontier Province. Jump forward to the 2008 election, they got 2% of the vote, and they lost control of both of those provinces. So, they didn't deliver. The pro-Taliban religious parties are very vocal in Pakistani politics, but Pakistanis themselves don't like these parties. So that's one long-term trend I think that's favorable. Second long-term trend, if you visited Pakistan about a decade ago and you flipped on the TV, you would have basically had one choice, which was Pakistan TV, which would have been a procession of, visiting dignitaries, shaking hands with whichever Pakistani dictator or prime minister was then in office. Now you have, something like 30 independent news stations. A lot of them are quite anti-American, but most of them very pro-democratic and very anti-Taliban, and that's another significant change. And finally, the lawyers' movement didn't come out of the political parties. This was really a genuine civil society movement, which was, basically effectively got Musharraf out of office. Without the lawyers' movement, Musharraf probably would still be in office. So those are three long-term kind of pluses on the Pakistan side. The enormous wild card here now is the floods, because we're very familiar with how the Pakistani society is very class-ridden. They've had a political class that in general has delivered absolutely nothing for their people, and you've got 20 million people homeless. And I think that Pakistan does have elements of a sort of pre-revolutionary feel, and that's been true I think throughout its history. But it's never had a charismatic religious leader like Khomeini, for instance, in Iran, but the floods I think change everything, and they may even change things in a positive way. It's such a wild card that it's hard to assess. But you can certainly imagine that as this slow motion crisis unfolds over the next year, that there'll be a lot of pissed off people in Pakistan demanding some kind of political change. And as you mentioned, Steve, the floods are obviously causing civil military relations to fray. They've never been good. And so that that does give me a very large pause. One other final point on the positive side, on the Pakistan side of the ledger, which is related to the the kind of electoral defeat of the MMA. If you look at support for suicide bombing in Pakistan, it's gone from 33% to 5% in the last several years. Numbers, the Taliban has conducted a number of self-inflicted wounds on itself, attacking the Pentagon, the Pakistani equivalent of the Pentagon, killing hundreds of policemen, soldiers, killing Benazir Bhutto. Where the Taliban once had a sort of religious Robin Hood image in Pakistan, that's more or less evaporated. And so that's another kind of long-term trend, and we see that with the Pakistani military operations in Swat, and then in South Waziristan. These were serious military operations. They were not done for the benefit of the Americans, as previous military operations had been. If you go back to sort of the Bush administration, one of those military operations in Waziristan actually began the very day that Secretary Powell arrived in Islamabad. So these were really performance art operations. So. Right. That we haven't talked about Afghanistan, and I want to sort of get your thoughts on that. But in Pakistan, there are some sort of longer-term trends that are good. But look, I mean, saying it's very easy to predict, various kinds of failures in Pakistan, because of course Pakistan is a very complicated place, which has had a very kind of, has made a lot of poor decisions in both its politics and its foreign policy.
Right, and I think everything you point to are reasons to be somewhat more encouraged, although the sort of policy implications you draw from them aren't entirely clear. I mean, obviously, if the fraying in civil-military relations causes, sort of again, if not a military coup, at least greater military meddling in the political system against a leadership that is not particularly legitimate, not particularly popular, then one has to worry about our ability to leverage any of that into the kind of policies we would like vis-a-vis Afghanistan. The other point I guess I'd make is if the more optimistic view of Pakistani politics prevails, then some of the concerns that have motivated extensive American involvement in Central Asia, such as the security of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal, maybe go down a little bit. If we're not particularly worried about massive political upheaval in Pakistan, then those concerns are less paramount. And I guess I've been more sanguine about issues like the security of that arsenal, which is something I care more about than the precise nature of Pakistani internal politics, as a result of some of the trends that you might point to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the concerns about the Pakistani nuclear arms are very overblown. I mean, I think it's of course a central concern of American statecraft to make sure that safeguards are in place and that there is some sort of contingency plan. But, states are very careful about their crown jewels, and Pakistan is no exception. And as you know, Steve, we've given $100 million to the United States to help them with that. They have passive action locks, which are quite sophisticated ways of protecting their nuclear weapons. And the idea of the Taliban, taking over a Pakistani nuke is just, it's fanciful. So that has never really been my concern. I think that what would be concerning is if there was some form of revolution in Pakistan with a lot of unforeseen consequences that threw up not necessarily a Taliban-style regime, but essentially a far-right, ultra-Pakistani nationalist, perhaps somewhat religious kind of alliance that was much more inclined to go to war with India. And I mean that, the floods are such a wild card, it's very hard to predict what it might throw up. But that is, I agree with you completely on the security of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal.
Let me actually, I want to probe on one other issue you raised, which is the fact that the Pakistani military has gotten more serious about trying to deal with the frontier provinces, and I think that's basically right. I mean, if there is a piece of good news in the sort of overall, what we used to call the global war on terror, is that in a number of places, Al-Qaeda or other extremist groups have, if not entirely worn out their welcome, have certainly engaged in things that have greatly reduced their popularity and legitimacy, and some of the tolerance that they were shown in Pakistan by the military, I think, did fade. The question, I guess, is how effective that's been and the degree to which the various crackdowns have had a somewhat inconsistent focus, in part because there are still elements in the Pakistani security apparatus that want to keep some of those groups either as hedges in Afghanistan or for other what they regard as other geostrategic purposes, and that therefore we are still constantly dealing with the possibility of them playing sort of a double game, that they crack down on these groups on Monday, but on Tuesday they slip them some more support and tell them, don't worry, they'll be protected. Do you have a clear sense of how that trend is going?
I think there has been a shift. I mean, the critical, something that is not well understood in the United States, the Red Mosque takeover by the Pakistani military, where I actually interviewed the guy who ran the mosque a few weeks before he got killed, was an absolutely critical moment in Pakistan's history, because up to that point, many of these groups were either clients of the Pakistani state or, Pakistani state sort of acquiesced, and a lot of them turned against the Pakistani government. And, then you had the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, forming an alliance essentially directed at attacking the Pakistani state and military. And the Pakistani government has gone after those groups with some real intensity, and of course it's also giving information about those groups to the Americans so that they can be targeted by the drone attacks. The Haqqani network in North Waziristan, which is the subject of almost all the drone attacks right now, has long been a client of the Pakistani state. Pakistanis haven't really done much in North Waziristan. There is a capacity problem. I do believe them when they say that. It's a 500,000-man army, but a lot of it's on the Indian border. Some of it was now up in the northern regions. A lot of it's now dealing with the flood. Even before the flood, this was an issue. So, when they say they have capacity problems, that's not completely. It's a very difficult area to work in. And I think that they'll always retain. We said July 2011. I think in the region that was interpreted as we're going to leave. And that you would use the word hedge, and they're going to hedge, and their national and strategic interests and ours are very different. However, I can't think of a time since 1979, when the Soviets invaded, that Pakistani interests and American interests have more closely coincided. I'm not saying that they're certainly not congruent, but they're much closer together than they were even 3 years ago, precisely because these groups have turned against the Pakistani state.
Mm-hmm. Maybe shifting over to Afghanistan for a second, how do you think we're doing there?
Well, it's not going well, but you mentioned a number of issues: the fraudulent, the large-scale fraud in the presidential election, the ineptitude and corruption of the government. I actually think that there are sort of deeper problems that are really what we need to be fixing, because corruption in that part of the world is hardly unusual. I mean, President Zardari next door is Mr. 10%. In Iran, the Iranian Republican Guard own about half the economy. Go to Pakistan, the military own about half of their economy. And ineptitude of government, you've got Ahmadinejad, on one side, you've got Pakistan on the other side, you've got Karimov in Uzbekistan, who boils people alive with sort of a forensic technique. And this is not a part of the world that is filled with, either incorrupt or particularly capable leaders. And in fact, when you look at the polling data, Afghans are not very concerned about the corruption of their government. They're concerned about two much more fundamental things. They're concerned about security and jobs. And we're not delivering the fundamental public good that the Taliban did deliver at enormous cost, imposing a theocracy and destroying what remained of the economy. When they came to power in '96, they did deliver security. And so we haven't really delivered that, which is why I think that the troop ramp-up does make sense. Afghans overwhelmingly score security as their main issue. And if you can't secure the Kabul to Kandahar road, which is the most politically important road in the country, and also economically the most important road, you've got a problem, and that's where we are right now.
Right. Well, I think this is probably the issue where you and I begin to part company, because I have yet to be persuaded that even ramping up, to where we currently are at, is going to make a fundamental strategic difference. It may have some advantages at the margin, but we're still, well below the canonical numbers that previous peacekeeping or previous counterinsurgency operations have had. The Army Field Manual points out that, you need a reliable local partner, and we both agree that there isn't a reliable local partner there. And even with a somewhat enhanced effort on the Pakistani side, it's still possible, I think, for Afghan Taliban to use the border as essentially a escape zone. So if they're confronted by superior force, as they occasionally are, they can slip away or just lie low. So I fear that we're going to be doing this for months, if not years, and never actually achieve anything that we would call a military victory. Meanwhile, we don't have, I think, the capacity to create the kind of effective central government in Afghanistan that might, in theory, solve this problem. And in a sense, whether the deadline is July 2011 or December 2011 or July 2012, we will be essentially facing the same debate no matter how long we continue to pursue this one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I share your pessimism about creating an effective central government, but I just don't think that's the main problem. I mean, Afghans are not, they're more concerned about security than any other issue. As, you know, I mean, Hobbes wrote about it in the shadow of the English Civil War. This is pretty much the oldest idea in political theory. So, you know, and that was really the problem in Iraq. I mean, you know, the fact that you couldn't travel between Baghdad International Airport and Baghdad City, which is only 5 miles, without being blown up by a suicide bomber, as was the case in 2005, said everything you really needed to know about what was going on in Iraq. And, you know, I think one of the things I think that is important that anybody, for the two people who are watching this, to understand is that, you know, Iraq was 20 times more violent in January of 2007 than Afghanistan is today. I mean, the coverage is not particularly, you know, in fact, Iraq is still twice as violent as Afghanistan is today. Afghanistan is not, the war is a relatively contained, relatively small numbers of people that die. In fact, if I walk out of my office in Washington after this, I'm more likely to be murdered in Washington, D.C. than I am to die in a war in Afghanistan right now. And, you know, the numbers are relatively small, but they are growing, and that's the problem. But let me just sort of put something else on the table here, which is, you know, one of the most common polling questions that you ask in any country is, do you think is life going to get better? And right now, that number, I just looked at NBC Wall Street Journal poll, in the United States is 32%. And in Afghanistan, according to BBC, ABC, it's 70%, which is a very high number. And the reason is that, you know, Afghans are not expecting their country to be turned into Belgium or Denmark. They're just basically looking for it to kind of have some measure of normalcy, similar to what they had in the 1970s in Afghanistan when the country was at peace with its neighbors and itself, and something of a tourist destination on the hippie trail to India. So there is a model for success. You know, it's not dreamer vision, I guess the burden of what you're saying, Steve, is that, you know, we should be doing less because the whole project isn't going to work. I guess that's the bottom line, right?
That's my fear. I mean, I shouldn't say it quite that strongly. I think a very reduced set of ambitions on our part, calling for much more decentralization of power, a return to something that looks more like the old Afghan state than what we've apparently been trying to create. Certainly a reduced American military footprint as rapidly as possible, because I think, again, that fuels part of the insurgency we face and doesn't seem to be providing the security. You know, we have now ramped up. All the forces that we're likely to send are there now. And I haven't seen yet a sign that the security situation has turned around significantly. If anything, that it's been getting steadily worse over the last year. Now, it's possible we'll hit an inflection point and things will turn around. But my sense is that even within the Obama administration now, there is a greater interest in looking for some kind of negotiated settlement, some kind of power-sharing arrangement, an attempt to pull away whatever elements of the Taliban you can bargain with, while recognizing that there are probably some that you'll never be able to accommodate. And that's ultimately a more promising strategy than thinking we not create a Belgium, that we can, essentially from the outside, create something like an effective Afghan government that won't require international tutelage for another 10 or 20 years at a minimum.
Well, you know, my guess is that if we're serious about stabilizing the country, it is going to be a long-term thing. It's not July 2011 or December 2011 or that. You know, these projects take a while. It's not, and I think, and the only project really that is that's really critical, of course, is building up the Afghan National Army, which is something that a lot more attention has been paid to in the last year or so. I think that obviously a U.S. military would say that the rising number of casualties is related to the large number of engagements, and so that may be true. Obviously, and then as you say, there may be an inflection point where the violence goes down. It's probably a little bit early to tell, but there's one thing that I would sort of take issue with slightly. I think something which is a kind of a common view, that Afghans reject international forces. In fact, the polling data on this is really extraordinary. In the most recent BBC-ABC poll, 68% of Afghans had a favorable view of U.S. military. I mean, there are parts of the United States where there may not be a 68% favorable view of U.S. military. And certainly for a Muslim country to have this is extraordinary. And then when you poll on the question of, do you have a favorable view of NATO or ISAF forces, and the numbers are sort of in the 63% range. So, the idea that Afghans reject foreign forces sort of as an antibody, it's just wrong. What they want is the foreign forces to deliver. They don't want the foreign forces to leave. Well, our problem hitherto is, but we haven't really delivered very much, partly because of early mistakes, the Bush's ideological opposition to nation building, and all the things that we're familiar with that's sort of got us in this place.
I guess I find the numbers encouraging. I don't find them compelling, and in part because I wonder to what extent, first of all, the favorable sense of international forces is really a reflection, or is it partly a reflection of the deep unpopularity of the government? That we obviously look preferable to much of the Karzai government. But then there's lots of anecdotal evidence, again, just that I see in press reports about the difficulty we have operating in the South, the fact that it's very hard to get cooperation from locals on a sustained basis, and again, that we're not able to ultimately defeat the central problem. And the central problem here is whether or not the United States and its allies is ever going to be able to render the Taliban a sufficiently weak, irrelevant political force that we can then either greatly reduce our numbers or simply withdraw and concentrate on economic development. And I have yet to be persuaded that we're able to do that, that this is ultimately a project that isn't purely military but has a military component. And we're not going to be able to achieve the kind of military victory that would be necessary there in anything like a realistic time frame. And that therefore the United States and its allies ought to be looking for a sort of a different approach to this. That isn't counterinsurgency centered and is more diplomatic in nature, focusing more on promoting some kind of political reconciliation there. Also, I think the Iraqi example is a cautionary tale here. That on the one hand, yes, the violence was certainly higher. We were able to temporarily stop that. We were never able to achieve the rest of the so-called surge, and things now appear to be sort of spiraling back down, and I worry about that being the fate of Afghanistan in 2014, even if we continue to stay there. At some point we will get out, and we won't have achieved any kind of political reconciliation that allows us to leave the place in good order. And if that's the case, then the money and lives we are spending now are being spent essentially to no good purpose.
Well, let me, because you raised a lot of interesting issues there. One point about, we don't seem to be getting much cooperation in the South. I think, I spent some time in Helmand, and it's not that the Afghans are first-order fence sitters, and they're also survivors. And, I was with a Marine unit. They come into a village. They say, the Marine Lieutenant Colonel, to his credit, told the villagers, I can't promise you that I'll be here 9 months from now, because he couldn't. He didn't know. When asked what their feelings were about, the United States military versus the Taliban, the village elders said, look, the U.S. military is powerful, the Taliban is powerful, and I'm going to be here, for the rest of my life. Just sort of, whichever way the wind is going to be blowing stronger, that's the way, and if he senses that the U.S. military is not going to be around, he's certainly not going to be helpful in any shape or form. Even talking to U.S. military personnel might end him up with his head chopped off. So I think that's part of the problem. Is the the July 2011 drawdown is that in a way it was too clever by half, because it was designed to signal things to the Afghan government and to the American people, but it signaled that we were just leaving it to the people in the region. On the decentralization of power, I totally agree. We imposed a highly centralized government on a very decentralized country, but just saying we should decentralize it, that would require basically a lawyer jerger, rewriting of the Constitution. I think it would be great. It's just that the mechanics of getting that done are not easy, and it's certainly not going to happen soon. On the negotiated settlement, I'm presuming that would include the Taliban, right?
Well, or some elements of the Taliban, and I think if we're being creative about this, we are as likely to get some kind of revised Afghan constitution and some kind of political compromise among different factions as we are likely to get a decisive military victory over the Taliban. So if we're trying to figure out what's the way in which we can meet minimum American objectives, which, by the way, you and I have failed, we haven't yet even discussed what our goals are, or ought to be, or what our interests are, but it seems to me we're as likely to get a kind of political settlement, possibly, if we're really lucky with some regional buy-in, as we are likely to get a purely military victory. And even General Petraeus has said repeatedly that this is not something you win primarily militarily, that it's going to have to involve political compromise, and I gather there are actually a variety of quiet efforts being made on that in that regard as well. I think that's where we're headed, whether rightly or wrongly, and I guess maybe making that more explicit and not talking so much in terms of an open-ended military commitment might make more sense.
Yeah, no, certainly in principle that all makes a lot of sense. I just, the devil is very much in the details. Are the Iranians going to be, part of that, and to what extent do they really want to be helpful? To what extent would the Indians do something to reassure the Pakistanis that they're not going to use Afghanistan as some giant, aircraft carrier at their rear? There's not, obviously people talk about this regional settlement, but it's kind of like, it's very nebulous about what the details are. One idea that Rick Inderfev has, and I've also written about, and I think makes a lot of sense, would be to try and create an independent Afghanistan that was recognized by the United Nations, and there were some sanctions in there that give it some teeth. Afghanistan was a neutral state in World War I and in World War II, so this is not this is part of Afghan political culture. And it might be a way of trying to reassure the Pakistanis that they don't have a closely aligned to India state at their rear, which is of course part of the problem that we have here. On the negotiated settlement, I'm enormously skeptical about it, because I wish this conflicts with my general optimism, because obviously you do need a negotiated settlement with elements of the Taliban, but I think there are several problems with this idea. First of all, when the Taliban have done peace deals with the Pakistani government, they've reneged on every one, and they used them as an effort to actually expand their reach and territory. Two, Mullah Omar's had 10 years to sort of say Al-Qaeda's a bad idea, 9/11's a bad idea, Bin Laden destroyed my regime, and he said none of these things. And every time there's a discussion of negotiations, the higher level Taliban people say this is all nonsense and none of this has been approved. They don't think they're losing. In an insurgency, that means you're winning. Why would they negotiate now when they could get a bigger piece of the pie later? Mullah Omar is not Metternich. He's shown no aptitude for realpolitik. He believes that he's doing God's will. Bin Laden is part of that. When the Taliban are in power, they've always hosted the Al-Qaeda. One of the most, I noticed that you signed off on the Afghanistan study group, Steve, and one of the things in there, it says that there's no evidence that the Taliban back in power would bring Al-Qaeda with them. Well, everywhere where they have been in power, they've always had Al-Qaeda with them. Right now, they're in power in the tribal regions of Pakistan, which is where the Al-Qaeda is living. And there is, making a distinction between the Pakistan Taliban and the Afghan Taliban isn't very helpful, when in fact all the Taliban factions are in Pakistan. They're headquartered there, and they themselves don't recognize the border, and no Pashtun does. So, those are just, there are probably 5 other reasons I can come up with. I wish I wasn't so skeptical about this. What is the moderate Taliban? Are they the Taliban who lets their girls go to school once a month. I think those, the quote-unquote moderate Taliban have already reconciled. We're now 10 years into this. They're the guys who are sitting in parliament, some of them. They're the guys who are going to these meetings in Mecca, which are being disavowed by the Taliban leadership. And so, I wish I wasn't skeptical, because that obviously at the end of the day, there has to be some negotiated solution with these folks. But I just see that being a very long-term project.
There's a lot there. Let me say a couple of things. I mean, I agree that there is lots of coordination between a number of these groups, and even over time a certain amount of ideological sympathy. I don't find that particularly surprising, particularly at this stage in the process, for essentially kind of balance of power reasons, right? The United States and its friends in the area have been going after all of these groups more or less simultaneously with various degrees of enthusiasm, and it's not surprising to me that therefore those groups have become rather tightly allied. The question is, if the United States and others were adopting a different approach, we would start seeing more friction between them. I think Mullah Omar has never been powerfully motivated by a desire to wage global jihad against the United States in the same manner that Osama bin Laden has. More importantly, and this is something you and I have, disagreed on in print a little bit, from an American strategic interest, the only real issue we have here, it seems to me, is the question of whether or not the outcome in Afghanistan is going to fundamentally affect American national security, and in particular whether or not the outcome in Afghanistan is likely to make al-Qaeda substantially more lethal or substantially more dangerous to the United States. And the central point in the Afghanistan Study Group report is that that's unlikely to be the case. Al-Qaeda now exists in lots of different places. It can plan and have clandestine cells in Pakistan, in Yemen, in parts of North Africa, in parts of Europe, conceivably, God forbid, here in the United States itself. And the likelihood that al-Qaeda would be able to both relocate back in Afghanistan and create the kind of infrastructure that would nonetheless be invisible and immune from American attack, even if we were no longer in Afghanistan in large numbers, is actually, the danger of that is quite remote. They had large camps back in the 90s, and we did attack them once or twice, but never very enthusiastically. But that was in the pre-9/11 world. I think if we ever saw bin Laden organizing large training camps in Afghanistan or anywhere else, we wouldn't hesitate to go after them in much the way we've been doing in Pakistan, but conceivably with even more enthusiasm. So when I look at the sort of cost-benefit here, it's not that I don't see certain problems there. It's just not clear to me that the benefits of spending $100 billion a year and having 100,000 American troops in Afghanistan in perpetuity, all of those costs, are sufficient in terms of the strategic benefits that they bring to be warranting, again, this sort of open-ended commitment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a good deal of merit to that. However, I mean, the fact is that even with the enormously constrained space that they now have, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban have in the tribal regions, which is under a lot of pressure, we still have Faisal Shahzad, trained by the Pakistani Taliban, almost blowing up a car in Times Square this year. We still have Najibullah Azazi training with Al-Qaeda, with a plan to blow up bombs in the Manhattan subway in 2009. So you can imagine if they had more space that they would have more opportunities, and if we're essentially relaxing the pressure on these insurgent groups by stepping back, we're not talking. Go ahead.
Well, it's not obvious that we'd be relaxing the pressure on them. I mean, there's a distinction between conducting a sort of counterinsurgency operation in Afghanistan, intending to defeat the Taliban and sort of build institutions in Afghanistan and train the army in Afghanistan, etc., and a set of counterterrorism operations that involve all of the usual components, from intelligence cooperation with friendly governments to routine police work to surveillance of various kinds, and then, when appropriate, the use of lethal force to go after specific terrorist organizations. Nobody in the Afghanistan study group is in favor of relaxing pressure on Al-Qaeda or groups that are helping Al-Qaeda. It's rather wondering whether all of the money and effort we're spending on counterinsurgency shouldn't be devoted back on the thing we're really worried about, which is groups that want to attack the United States.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, what the strategy or set of tactics you just outlined sounds exactly like the Bush administration did between 2002 and until almost they left office. I mean, it was a sort of counterterrorism, special forces, do it light, don't put a lot of resources, and into that stepped, a reinvigorated Taliban. What's the difference between?
First of all, it was much less expensive. Second of all, it I think did do an awful lot to reduce the threat we faced from Al-Qaeda. In a sense, the counterterrorism approach, I don't defend everything the Bush administration did on that front as well, but to the extent that they were focusing on Al-Qaeda itself, they, I think, did a reasonably effective job of disrupting them, and there's no reason why we can't continue to do that and shouldn't continue to do that. I think it's true that that they'll be able to continue to plan certain operations. Fortunately, they don't seem to be doing it very effectively. They seem to be making a lot of mistakes. But I think the idea that we're going to prevent Al-Qaeda from trying to conduct operations against the United States by winning in Afghanistan is fallacious. They're going to be out there. If they're not in Afghanistan, they'll be somewhere else. If they're not in Pakistan, they'll be somewhere else, and that problem's likely to persist for a while. I would like us to be focusing our time and energy on that problem more than we are focusing on attempting to, I don't want to say do the impossible, but let's just say do the very, very difficult in a country we don't understand very well.
Yeah, well, we're just getting back to this question of they're in Yemen, they're in Somalia. Yes, that's true, but at the end of the day, they're headquartered on the Afghan-Pakistan border. Al-Qaeda was founded in Peshawar in 1988. Ayman al-Zawahiri and bin Laden are still there. They probably spent more of their adult lives in Afghanistan and Pakistan than they have in their own countries at this point. And, that is where people continue to go training. We've had this recent kind of very nebulous thing where there may be attacks in Germany or Britain, or it's not really clear. But the one thing that is clear is the Germans who are getting training were getting training in the tribal regions. They weren't getting training in Yemen or Somalia. So this continues to be the kind of the central location of these groups. And Americans who go for training, tend to want to get to Pakistan's tribal regions. There's probably some romantic thing about hooking up with Al-Qaeda if you have this sort of Al-Qaeda Central, if you have this kind of idea. So, Steve, I take all your points, and I think that none of this is easy. One thing just to extend the conversation a little bit. I think one mistake the Obama administration may have had is by focusing entirely on Al-Qaeda, or making the focus Al-Qaeda, which is understandable. Lost in all that is that when the Taliban were in power, every Muslim insurgent group in the world was also there. That was their headquarters, whether it was the Philippine Moro Liberation Front, or the Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, or Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, or the list. It was every single group. Lashkar-e-Taiba, Harakat al-Mujahideen. And I think if the Taliban did come back, it's not just that Al-Qaeda would come with them, it would be all these other groups as well. I take your point completely. They're not going to set up large-scale training camps amenable to overhead bombing. But they would set up a larger version of what they already have in the tribal regions, which is significant enough.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I guess I would want to think a little bit more about it. My first thought is to say, gee, if all of the bad guys in the world wanted to confine themselves in Afghanistan, that would be wonderful. And I can't think of a better place I'd want them all located. But that's maybe a little bit too flip, a little bit too glib a response. I wanted to ask you a slightly different question, and maybe we could throw this out and wrap up with this. What advice would you be giving, President Obama, General Petraeus at this point, and maybe as a follow-on to that, what sort of developments in the region might lead you to change your mind about, sort of your general set of prescriptions? And I'm willing to answer the same question, too.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I've even given any prescriptions, except to say that, I think that a more serious effort was needed, and we'll see, it may not work. But what I would be looking for, given the very short domestic political time clock, is some easy-to-see deliverables that can kind of say that this project has got some chance of success. And I mentioned earlier in our discussion the Kabul to Kandahar road. I think that if you could sort of drive down that road without fear of being kidnapped or being killed by a suicide attacker, in the next 6 months, that would be, that would be very significant, because it would sort of, for Afghans, that's something they can immediately see. It's a very tangible thing. We can drive now between the two most important cities in the country without a personal security detail, and that was up till 2004. 2005, that was plausible. I would also be looking at something like the Kajaki Dam, which is this major dam that should be delivering electricity to 2 million Afghans in the south, which is still not online. So those are the sorts of things I think that if it's about persuading the Afghans that we're sort of here to help, those would be two things. The other, one really obvious thing I'd be looking for is capturing or killing Osama bin Laden. Which
that would be wonderful.
Which would kind of be a nice bookend to the war on terror, the war formerly known as the war on terror. I think it's kind of amazing that we've spent $500 billion on our intelligence agencies since 9/11, and we don't know the answer to three very basic questions: where is Mullah Omar? Where is Ayman al-Zawahiri? Where is and where's Bin Laden? So those are three kind of concrete ideas.
Yeah. They're actually similar to my view on the same thing. Obviously, I've been asked this occasionally, sort of what would lead me to change my general view that we ought to be getting out or adopting a very different strategy there. And because I tend to view this in rather ruthless cost-benefit terms, obviously anything that made me think that the costs were going down or that the program was working better than it has been would lead me to at least start readjusting it. I also like your idea about bin Laden. I think I've said for a long time that one of the things we have lacked in conflicts like this is an appropriate exit moment. You referred to a bookend, but in some cases like this, of protracted wars, what leaders ultimately seize upon is a moment where they can plausibly say, our work here is done. And whether or not that was actually true, it seems to me that if we did capture bin Laden or were aware that he was no longer with us, that would be an appropriate moment that a president could seize upon to then say, we've accomplished what we needed to accomplish in the aftermath of September 11th. What worries me, I think, about all of the benchmarks that we can point to, and I think the ones you identified are worthwhile, is a little bit of sort of the teaching to the test. That is to say, we set up a benchmark, we then achieve it, but it turns out not to be all that meaningful. The Taliban agrees to lie low for 6 months while we drive up and down the highway. We declare success. We leave, and then, of course, the highway becomes dangerous again. All of this is to underscore my concern that this kind of sort of large-scale social engineering in such a conflicted place is not something we're particularly good at. And if we're not committing ourselves to, a decade or more of pretty expensive and pretty sustained effort, then we have to find a different approach to the problem.
Fair enough.
Well, have we exhausted each other and the topic?
Well, I'm sure it's not a topic that is easily exhausted, but I'm sure we've exhausted the unfortunate person or persons who is watching this.
Well, they undoubtedly are volunteers, but then they all have the option of obviously clicking off prior to this point. For any of you who've survived till the end, thanks for watching and listening.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. Thank you.
It was a pleasure talking with you.
Okay.
Bye bye.